My name is Alara Vane, and today I learned that blood isn't thicker than water. It's thinner than the ink on a forged signature. For 22 years, I was the quiet one, the daughter who stayed by Grandma Evelyn's side while my parents, Arthur and Madeline, chased social status in the high-rises of Seattle. I was the one who held her hand when the cancer took her voice, while my sister, Clara, was busy spending an inheritance she hadn't yet earned. But when the will was read, the world I knew inverted. Clara got the $1.8 million cash fund, the family's lucrative shipping logistics empire, and the lakeside mansion. I was given a gift of character, a dilapidated Victorian ruin on 4th Avenue that had been flagged for demolition twice. My father called it a lesson in humility. My mother called it a fresh start. I call it a declaration of war. They think they've buried me in this dust, but they forgot one thing. Grandma Evelyn didn't believe in coincidences, and she certainly didn't believe in leaving her legacy to snakes. The rain in Seattle felt like liquid lead, cold and relentless as I stood on the sidewalk of 4th Avenue. Behind me, the roar of my father's black Range Rover faded into the distance. They didn't even offer to drop me off at the door. They simply left me at the curb with a single cardboard box and a heavy, rusted iron key. "It's a fixer-upper, Alara," my mother had whispered, her voice smelling of expensive gin and fake sympathy. "A project to keep your idle hands busy now that you won't be distracting us at the office." I looked at the house. It was a 3-story skeletal remains of a Victorian, huddled between 2 modern warehouses like a forgotten ghost. The paint was peeling in long gray strips, and the porch sagged like a broken jaw. It was an insult in architectural form. My parents wanted me out of the way so they could liquidate Grandma's assets without me asking questions about the sudden change in her will. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned. A warning or a welcome, I couldn't tell. I pushed the key into the lock. It took 3 tries and a shoulder shove to get the door open. The air inside was thick with the scent of cedar, damp rot, and 40 years of silence. "Why, Grandma?" I whispered, my voice echoing off the bare, stained walls. "You told me I was the only one you trusted. You told me the Vane legacy belonged to the one who understood its heart. How could you leave me this grave?" I walked through the foyer. My flashlight cut a yellow path through the gloom. Dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the beam. I reached the dining room where a massive, water-stained floral wallpaper hung in tatters. I sank onto a dust-covered crate, the weight of the day finally crushing my chest. My parents had presented a will dated only 2 months ago, a time when Grandma was so heavily medicated she couldn't recognize her own face in the mirror. In that version, Clara was the savior of the family name, and I was the artistic soul who needed the simplicity of a ruin. I spent the first night shivering in a sleeping bag on the floor of what used to be a library. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. I kept thinking about Grandma's last words. She hadn't talked about the company or the money. She had gripped my wrist with a strength that terrified me and hissed, "The truth is in the skin, Alara. Don't let them tear the house down. Look for the silver lining." I woke up at dawn to the sound of water dripping. The roof was leaking directly onto the dining room floor. If I didn't fix it, the house would be a pile of splinters by winter. I headed to the basement, hoping to find the tools Grandma's old caretaker used to keep. The basement was a labyrinth of rusted pipes and cobwebs. Among the debris, I found a heavy sledgehammer and a crowbar. As I hauled them back upstairs, my anger began to boil over. "They think I'm a failure?" I shouted at the empty walls. "They think I'm just gonna sit here and rot?" I moved to the dining room where the damp wallpaper was bulging. I hated this wallpaper. It was an ugly, sickly yellow gold. old, much like the life Clara was currently living. I jammed the crowbar in a seam in the wall to rip away a soaked section of plaster, but the tool didn't sink into wood. It hit something hard, something that rang with a dull metallic clink. I stopped. I tapped the wall again. Clink, clink. This wasn't lath and plaster. I tore away a massive strip of the yellow wallpaper, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beneath the floral pattern wasn't wood, it was a sheet of heavy-duty industrial-grade steel. I began to work frantically, ignoring the dust stinging my eyes and the blisters forming on my hands. I ripped, pounded, and scraped. Within an hour, I had cleared a 4-foot section of the wall. It wasn't just a steel plate, it was a door, a massive, high-security vault door, seamlessly integrated into the structural frame of the house. There was no keypad, no dial, just a small circular indentation and a narrow vertical slit. My mind raced. The silver lining. I reached for the locket I had worn since I was 10, this silver disc Grandma Evelyn told me never to take off. It was a heavy, ugly thing with a jagged edge. I had always thought it was just a piece of eccentric jewelry. I pressed the edge of the locket into the vertical slit. It fit perfectly. Then I placed my thumb into the circular indentation. A faint electronic hum vibrated through the floorboards. A series of internal bolts retracted with the sound of a heavy machine gun. Thud, thud, thud. The steel door recessed an inch and slid sideways into the wall. I stepped inside. The space was a hidden room, no larger than a walk-in closet, but it was pristine. It was lined with filing cabinets, a small desk, and a large black safe. On the desk sat a single envelope with my name in Grandma Evelyn's unmistakable, elegant script. I opened the envelope. Ilara, if you are reading this, then Arthur and Madeline have done exactly what I feared. They will have presented a forged will. They will have tried to exile you. But this house is not a ruin, my darling. It is a fortress, and the documents in this room are the keys to their kingdom. I opened the black safe. Inside was the real last will and testament of Evelyn Vane, dated only 3 days before her death, witnessed by a private notary my father didn't own. In this will, Arthur and Madeline were completely disinherited for gross moral turpitude and documented embezzlement. Clara was given a small trust fund, contingent on her completing 5 years of community service. The entire estate, the shipping empire, the $1.8 million, the properties, and the hidden offshore accounts totaling over $40 million were left to me. But there was something even darker. Underneath the will was a stack of photographs and a digital recorder. I hit play. Arthur, the doctor says the placebo heart medication is working. The old woman thinks she's just getting weaker. She'll be gone by the end of the month, and the new will is already signed by the witnesses we hired. My breath hitched. They hadn't just forged a will. They had slowly, methodically murdered the one who gave them everything. I looked at the steel walls around me. My parents thought they had left me in a grave. They didn't realize they had handed me the evidence locker for their own execution. I picked up the phone on the desk, a direct line to a federal prosecutor Grandma had known for decades. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I felt like the steel in the walls. My name is Ilara Vane, and today I have a story to tell you, and I have the receipts to burn it all down. The air in the hidden vault was cold, but for the first time in years, I felt a warmth spreading through my chest, a predatory, righteous heat. My father used to say that the Vane family was built on solid ground, but as I stared at the medical records and the digital recordings, I realized we were built on a swamp of blood and lies. They thought they had discarded me like a broken tool, sending me to this ruin to fade away. But they didn't understand the architecture of this house. Grandma Evelyn hadn't just built a safe, she had built a trap. And as I looked at the $40 million in offshore account ledgers, I realized I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the landlord of their nightmares. I spent the next 6 hours in a trance of discovery. The vault was a masterclass in forensic preparation. Grandma Evelyn had spent her final painful year documenting every theft, every bribe, and every whispered conversation. She knew her heart was failing, or rather being failed by the people she raised. "You were always the smartest of us, Grandma," I whispered, running my fingers over a ledger that detailed Arthur's secret gambling debts in Macau, debts he had paid using the company's pension fund. I picked up the satellite phone on the desk. It wasn't a standard device, it was an encrypted line. I dialed the number Grandma had written on the back of the envelope. It belonged to Marcus Thorne, a man my father feared more than God, the lead prosecutor for the Financial Crimes Division. Thorne speaking. The voice was like gravel under a heavy boot. "My name is Alara Vane," I said, my voice steady. "I'm calling from the 4th Avenue vault. The crown jewels are ready for collection." There was a long silence on the other end. "Evelyn said this day would come. She told me to wait for a girl who smelled like cedar and looked like she could carry the weight of a skyscraper. Stay in the house, Alara. Don't tell your parents you found it. If they find out the ghost architect is active, they won't just sue you. They'll finish what they started with Evelyn." I hung up and walked back out into the dining room. The house felt different now. The peeling wallpaper didn't look like rot anymore. It looked like camouflage. The sagging porch wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a deterrent. My phone, my old personal one, buzzed on the crate. It was a text from Clara. "Hey sis, hope the shack isn't too drafty. Dad just bought me a limited edition Ferrari to celebrate my new CEO title. Sucks to be the creative one, right? Don't forget to sign the final probate waiver tomorrow. Kisses." I stared at the screen. Clara was 24, and her biggest accomplishment was choosing the color of her leather interior. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., the Vane family would gather at the downtown headquarters to officially finalize the probate. Once I signed that waiver, the forged will would become permanent, and the $40 million hidden in the vault would be legally untouchable. They thought they were bringing me there to sign my own death warrant. They didn't know I was bringing the evidence of their murder. I didn't sleep. I spent the night scanning every document using the high-speed scanner in the vault. I uploaded the files to a secure cloud server and sent the link to Thorne. Around 3 a.m., I heard a car crawl slowly past the house. I killed my flashlight and moved to the window. It was a silver sedan, the kind the Vane Global security team used. They were checking on me. They wanted to make sure the failure was still in her cage. "Watch me," I whispered as the car disappeared into the rain. Morning came with a sickly gray light. I didn't wear the rags they expected. I went to the back of the vault where a small wardrobe was hidden. Inside was a charcoal gray power suit Grandma had tailored me months ago. Beside it was a pair of black obsidian earrings and a note, "Wear your armor, Alara. Lions don't dress like sheep." I arrived at Vane Global headquarters at 9:45 a.m. The building was a tower of glass and ego, a monument to a legacy my father was currently gutting. The receptionists, who used to treat me like a nuisance, looked confused as I strode through the lobby. I didn't look like the girl who had been exiled 2 days ago. I looked like the woman who owned the pavement they were standing on. The boardroom was on the 40th floor. When the elevator doors opened, I saw my parents and Clara sitting around the massive mahogany table. They were drinking champagne. Arthur looked at his watch, a smug grin. "You're late, Alara," he said, not even looking down. "The lawyers have the waiver ready. Sign it and we'll increase your monthly stipend by $500. It's more than you deserve for that pile of wood on 4th Avenue. Madeline, my mother, leaned back, her eyes scanning my suit with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Where did you get that outfit, Alara? Did you spend your last cent trying to look like us?"
"I'm not trying to look like you, Mother," I said, pulling out a chair at the head of the table, the chair my father was currently occupying. "Move, you're in my seat." The room went deathly quiet. Clara laughed, a shrill, nervous sound. "The shack must have had lead paint. She's gone crazy. Dad, just make her sign so we can go to the yacht club." Arthur stood up, his face turning a dark, violent shade of red. "You've had your fun, Alara. Sign the papers and get out. You're embarrassing the family." "The family was embarrassed when you started swapping Grandma's heart medication for sugar pills, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a razor. Madeline dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Arthur's face went from red to a ghostly, translucent white. "What did you just say?" Madeline stammered, her hands shaking so much she had to grip the table. "I said the ghost architect has finished the audit." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of photos, the ones from the vault. I slid them across the table. They showed Arthur meeting with the notary in the middle of the night. They showed the secret ledger of the Macau debts. "You went into the house," Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. "You found it. We searched that place for months. How did you find it?" "Grandma Evelyn didn't leave the house to me because it was a ruin. She left it to me because it was a filter. She knew you were too arrogant to look behind the ugly wallpaper. You only value what shines. You never looked at the bones." Clara gripped her phone, her knuckles white. "Dad, do something. She's lying. She's trying to steal our money." "It was never your money, Clara. And as for doing something," I looked at the door. At that exact moment, the boardroom doors burst open. Marcus Thorne stepped in, followed by 6 federal agents in windbreakers that read FBI Financial Crimes. "Arthur Vane, Madeline Vane, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and first-degree murder of Evelyn Vane. We have the black box recordings, we have the nurse's testimony, and we have the real will." As the agents moved in with handcuffs, Arthur lunged for the pile of documents on the table, trying to rip them, but an agent tackled him to the floor. My mother began to wail, a sound of pure, selfish grief. Clara just sat there, frozen, realizing her Ferrari and her CEO title were evaporating into thin air. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out at the city. The rain was finally stopping. "The audit is complete," I whispered. I wasn't the failure anymore. I was the Vane legacy, and I was just getting started.
Winning isn't the end of a war, it's just the beginning of the cleanup. As I watched the FBI lead my parents out of the Vane Global boardroom in handcuffs, I expected to feel a surge of triumph. Instead, I felt the cold weight of the crown. Arthur and Madeline were gone, but they had left behind a carcass. While I was scrubbing floors in a ruin on 4th Avenue, they were bleeding this company dry to cover up a lifetime of failures. My father didn't just steal a legacy, he set it on fire. Now I have 48 hours to find the $40 million Grandma Evelyn hid, or the bank will seize the very tower I'm standing in. The shack was the evidence locker, but the real treasure hunt has just begun. The silence that followed the arrests was louder than the sirens. The boardroom, once a place of calculated arrogance, now smelled of spilled champagne and expensive perfume turned sour by sweat. Clara was still sitting in her chair, staring at her reflection in the polished mahogany table, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was all a prank. "Get up, Clara," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow room. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a venomous shock. "You did this. You destroyed our family. You put Mom and Dad in cages. Do you have any idea what this will do to my reputation? I was supposed to be on the cover of Business Elite next month." "Your reputation was built on a forgery and a murder, Clara," I said, walking to the head of the table and picking up the master ledger. "Go home. If you're lucky, the feds won't find proof that you knew about the medication, but you're out. As of 10 minutes ago, I am the sole executor of the Vane estate." I didn't wait for her to scream. I signaled to the security team. men who were now looking at me with a newfound, terrified respect to escort her out. I needed the room. I needed to think. Marcus Torn walked back in, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's done, Alara. We have the physical evidence from the vault, but there's a problem, a big one." He dropped a thick red folder on the table. While Arthur was playing CEO, he was using the company's core assets as collateral for his Macau debts. He didn't just spend the cash, he leveraged the shipping fleet. The bank is moving to foreclose. You have 48 hours to settle a $35 million liquidity gap, or Vane Global goes into receivership. You'll own a name, but you won't own a single ship. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. $35 million. The golden child, Clara, had been bragging about a Ferrari while the foundation of the empire was turning to dust. "Grandma's will mentioned $40 million in offshore accounts," I said, my mind racing back to the steel room on 4th Avenue. "But the ledgers I found only showed the account numbers, not the access keys." "Without those keys, that money is just numbers on a screen in the Cayman Islands," Thorne warned. "And Arthur isn't talking. He thinks if he stays quiet, the company will collapse and you'll be left with nothing but that ruin on 4th Avenue. He'd rather see it all burn than see you win." I looked out the window at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in that old Victorian house, behind the steel door or under the rotting floorboards, was the second half of the puzzle. Grandma Evelyn wouldn't have given me the evidence without giving me the means to survive the fallout. "I'm going back," I said, "back to the bones." I returned to the house on 4th Avenue at dusk. The rain had turned into a thick, clinging fog. I didn't enter like a victim this time. I walked in like a general. I went straight to the dining room and stepped into the hidden vault. I sat at the small desk and stared at the letter Grandma had left me. "The truth is in the skin, Alara. Look for the silver lining." I had interpreted the skin as the wallpaper, but the wallpaper only revealed the vault. What if there was another layer? I looked at the silver locket on the desk, the jagged key that had opened the door. I picked it up and held it to the light. Under a magnifying glass, I saw tiny, microscopic engravings along the jagged edge. They weren't just decorative, they were coordinates. 74.602 north, 122.331 west. "The shipping yards," I whispered, "the original Pier 42. Pier 42 was where Evelyn Vane had started. It was a derelict piece of the waterfront that the company had abandoned decades ago. Arthur had tried to sell it years ago, but Grandma had blocked him in court, claiming it was sentimental. I drove to the waterfront, the salt air stinging my lungs. Pier 42 was a skeleton of rusted cranes and rotting timber, cordoned off by high chain-link fences. I used the bolt cutters from my trunk to break the lock. The silence here was heavy, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 foghorns. I followed the coordinates to an old corrugated steel shed at the very end of the pier, the original office of Vane Shipping. Inside, it smelled of oil and old paper. In the center of the room sat an ancient cast-iron floor safe. It looked like a relic from the 1920s, but when I cleared the dust from the dial, I saw a familiar circular indentation. I pressed my thumb against it. Click. Whir. The old safe didn't open with a dial, it opened with a biometric scan. Inside wasn't a stack of cash, it was a single high-tech hardware wallet, a cold storage device, and a handwritten ledger. The ledger didn't just have account numbers, it had the names of every politician, bank manager, and judge Arthur had bribed over the last 10 years. This isn't just $40 million, I realized, flipping through the pages. This is a kill switch. Grandma Evelyn hadn't just saved money, she had weaponized it. She knew Arthur would try to bankrupt the company to spite me, so she had gathered enough leverage to force the banks to back down. Suddenly, the headlights of a car cut through the darkness outside the shed. A door slammed. "I knew you'd come here, Alara," a voice called out. I stepped to the door. It was Henderson, the family lawyer, the man who'd helped Arthur forge the will. He was holding a small silver pistol, and his eyes were wild with desperation. "Arthur told me about the pier years ago," Henderson hissed, stepping into the shed. "He thought the old woman was hiding physical gold here. Give me that device, Alara. I can get both of us out of the country. I can make the foreclosure disappear, but I won't go to jail for your father's mistakes."
I held the hardware wallet tight. "You're already going to jail, Henderson. The feds are at the office right now. If you pull that trigger, you're not a co-conspirator anymore. You're a murderer. And Grandma Evelyn has a recording of you, too." I pointed to the ceiling. A small red light was blinking, a motion-activated camera. Henderson froze. In that second of hesitation, the sound of sirens erupted from the street. Marcus Torn hadn't let me go to the pier alone. I looked at Henderson as the police swarmed the shed. The Vane family legacy doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who keeps the records.
The weight of the hardware wallet in my hand felt like a live wire, pulsing with the power to either resurrect Vane shipping or incinerate it. Henderson was led away in plastic zip ties, his face a mask of pathetic ruin, but I didn't feel relief. I felt the tightening of a new knot. Grandma Evelyn's ledger revealed a terrifying truth. Arthur was never the mastermind. He was too impulsive, too blinded by the flash of a Macau casino. The real architect of the family's moral decay was my mother, Madeline. As the bank's 48-hour clock ticked down, I realized she had one final play. A shadow buyer waiting to swallow the company whole for a fraction of its value. The ruin on 4th Avenue was the shield, but I was about to find out who held the sword. The sirens at Pier 42 faded into the foggy distance, leaving me alone with Marcus Thorne and the cold, salt-crusted hardware wallet. The wind off the sound bit through my charcoal blazer, a sharp reminder that the elements, like the law, had no mercy for the unprepared. "You have the access keys, Alara," Thorne said, leaning against his sedan. "But don't think for a second the bank cares about justice. To them, you're just a 22-year-old girl with a pile of debt and a criminal father. They'll pull the plug at 9 a.m. tomorrow unless you make the numbers move." "The numbers will move," I said, clutching the ledger to my chest. "But I need to know who is behind Aegis Holdings. They're the ones who just offered to buy the bank's debt for pennies on the dollar. If they close that deal, I lose control of the board." Thorne's face darkened. "We've been tracking Aegis. They're a shell company based out of Luxembourg. We couldn't crack the ownership until your grandmother's hardware wallet pinged our servers. Alara, Aegis isn't a competitor. It's a family trust, one your father didn't even know existed." I felt the blood drain from my face. Madeline! My mother had always played the role of the socialite, the gin-drinking, Chanel-wearing accessory to Arthur's ego. But while he was losing millions at the baccarat tables, she was quietly siphoning the marketing budget into Aegis. She wasn't just his wife, she was his landlord, waiting for the moment he collapsed so she could take the empire for herself. I didn't go to a hotel. I went back to the house on 4th Avenue. I needed the walls. I needed the silence. I stepped back into the vault and plugged the hardware wallet into the terminal. Access granted. Balance $42,384,108.08. The money was there. It was enough to clear the bank debt and stabilize the fleet, but it wouldn't stop the hostile takeover from Aegis. I needed to find the kill switch Grandma had mentioned in her final letter. I looked at the ledger of bribes. Page 44. Madeline Vane. Payments to the broker. "Who is the broker?" I whispered. I pulled away the remaining yellow wallpaper in the vault, searching for one last secret. Behind a heavy steel structural beam, I found a small recessed compartment. Inside was a single digital micro SD card and a note written in a shaky hand. "In case the wolf devours the sheep, Madeline's true face." I slid the card into the reader. A digital video file opened. It was a surveillance feed from our lakeside mansion dated 3 years ago. It showed my mother meeting with the head of the Port Authority. She wasn't bribing him. She was blackmailing him with evidence of a shipping lane smuggling ring she had set up herself. She didn't just steal the money, I realized, the horror sinking in. She turned Vane Shipping into a ghost fleet for illegal cargo. Arthur was just the loud, bright distraction while she ran the real business in the dark. At 7 a.m. the next morning, I stood in the lobby of the First National Bank. I didn't have an appointment. I had a hardware wallet and a digital file that could bring down the entire state's shipping infrastructure. The chairman of the board, a man named Sterling who had played golf with my father for 20 years, finally agreed to see me. He looked at me with bored contempt. "Ms. Vane, the Aegis offer is on my desk. It's a guaranteed exit. Your family has become a liability. Why should I wait another hour?" I didn't speak. I laid the ledger on his desk. Then I slid my tablet forward and played the first 10 seconds of the broker video. Sterling's face turned from bored to ashen. He looked at the ledger, then at the video, then at me. "If this goes public, the Port Authority falls. The bank's investments in the waterfront will be worthless. You're holding a grenade, Alara." "And I'm prepared to pull the pin," I said, my voice as cold as the steel in the 4th Avenue vault. "Cancel the Aegis deal. Accept the $35 million transfer from my Cayman account now. I want a full release of all liens on the Vane fleet by noon." Sterling's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. "You're just like your grandmother. She was the only person in this city I was truly afraid of. I see she left her teeth to you." By 11:45 a.m., the debt was cleared. I walked out of the bank as the majority shareholder and CEO of a debt-free Vane Global. But there was one last person to visit. I went to the county jail. I didn't ask to see Arthur. I asked to see Madeline. She sat behind the plexiglass, still wearing her silk blouse, looking more like a queen in exile than a prisoner. She smiled when she saw me. "Did you lose it all, Alara? Did Aegis take the keys? I told Arthur you were too soft for this world." I held up the digital card. "Aegis is dead, Mother. I found the broker tapes. I found the smuggling logs. I didn't just take the company. I gave the evidence to the feds. You're not going to a minimum security spa. You're going to a federal penitentiary for the rest of your life." Her smile vanished. For the first time, the mask of the socialite cracked, revealing the hollow, hungry void beneath. I built that empire. I did what Evelyn didn't have the stomach to do." "Evelyn built the world," I said, standing up and tucking the silver locket back under my shirt. "You just tried to haunt it. Enjoy the silence, Madeline. I have a house to rebuild." The crown of Vane Global was finally on my head, but the throne was sitting on a powder keg. Clearing the debt was a tactical strike, but Madeline's scream in the visitor's room echoed a deeper truth. The corruption didn't end with her arrest. It was woven into the very concrete of Seattle. I returned to the house on 4th Avenue, not as a victim, but as a restorer. I wanted to heal the ruin, to strip away the rot and find the soul of the woman who raised me. But as the contractors began to pull away the structural beams behind the vault, we realized that the steel door wasn't just a safe, it was a gateway. Grandma Evelyn hadn't just built a fortress, she had built a nerve center. The sound of circular saws and hammers filled the Victorian hall, a symphony of reconstruction that felt like a long overdue heartbeat. I stood in the dining room, watching as the lead architect, a man named Silas who had been loyal to my grandmother, inspected the void where the vault door had slid. "Ilara," Silas called out, his voice muffled by a dust mask, "you need to see this. We were checking the load-bearing capacity of the foundation to install the new support pillars. The steel vault isn't bolted to the floor. It's sitting on a hydraulic lift system." I stepped over a pile of debris, my heart skipping a beat. Silas pointed his laser level into the dark cavity behind the vault's rear wall. There was a gap, a clean, vertical shaft that descended straight into the earth. "This shouldn't exist," I whispered. "The blueprints I found in the archives show solid limestone here."
Blueprints can be forged just as easily as wills, Silas replied. He pulled a heavy lever disguised as a rusted pipe. With a groan of ancient gears, a section of the basement floor slid open, revealing a spiral staircase made of cold rolled steel. I took a flashlight and began the descent. The air grew cooler, smelling of salt and wet stone. At the bottom, I wasn't in a basement. I was in a tunnel. It was wide, reinforced with timber and brick, stretching out in two directions. One led toward the waterfront, the other toward the city center. The Seattle Underground, I realized. But this isn't part of the tourist maps. This is a private artery. I followed the path toward the water. Every 50 feet there were small alcoves containing wooden crates. I pried one open. Inside weren't gold bars or smuggled goods. They were archives, physical paper backups of every shipping manifest from 1950 to 1990. Grandma Evelyn hadn't just kept a vault of crimes. She had kept the history of the city's commerce, the real version, untainted by digital manipulation. She knew that one day the servers would be wiped and only the paper would remain to tell the truth. But as I explored deeper, I found something more personal. A small room furnished with a simple cot, a desk, and a radio. On the wall was a map of the city, with red pins marking every property my father had tried to sell. Evelyn hadn't just lived in this house, she had lived under it. She had been a ghost in her own empire, watching the rot from below, waiting for someone, waiting for me to take up the mantle. While I was in the depths, the surface was beginning to burn. Clara, stripped of her Ferrari, her CEO title, and her dignity, was sitting in a dimly lit bar in the industrial district. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat Julian Vane, our father's estranged brother, a man Grandma had exiled 30 years ago for unspeakable cruelty. "She thinks she's won," Clara hissed, sliding a set of stolen blueprints across the table. "She thinks that old house is her sanctuary, but I know where the gas lines are. I know where the support beams are weakest." Julian smiled, a jagged, oily expression. Evelyn always preferred Ilara. She saw potential in the weak, but the Vane name belongs to those who are willing to take it. If we can't have the company, we can at least ensure there's nothing left for her to rule. Back at the house, I reached the end of the waterfront tunnel. It opened into a small camouflaged door right beneath Pier 42. I realized the coordinates on the locket weren't just for the shed. They were for this entire subterranean network. This was how she moved unnoticed. This was her silver lining, the ability to see the world from the roots up. I climbed back up to the dining room, my mind buzzing with the scale of her foresight. But as I stepped on the porch to breathe the night air, I smelled something that didn't belong. Not the salt of the sound, but the sharp, sweet tang of gasoline. I looked toward the basement windows. A shadow was moving near the side of the house. "Clara?" I called, my voice tight. A match flared in the darkness. Clara was standing there, her eyes wide and manic, holding a 5-gallon jerry can. Beside her, Julian Vane stepped into the light, a heavy iron wrench in his hand. "You took my life, Ilara," Clara screamed. "You turned Mom and Dad into criminals. You made me a joke. Let's see how much you love the bones of this place when they're glowing red." She threw the match toward a trail of fuel leading into the basement. Whoosh! A wall of orange flame erupted, climbing the dry Victorian wood with terrifying speed. The heat hit me like a physical blow. "The tunnels!" I shouted. I didn't run for the street. I ran back inside. I knew the fire would travel up the stairs, but the steel vault was fireproof, and beneath the vault was the only exit they didn't know about. Julian lunged at me, swinging the wrench. I dodged, the Mel whistling past my ear. I grabbed a heavy brass coat rack from the foyer and swung it with every ounce of rage I had. It caught him in the ribs, sending him sprawling into the burning basement. "Clara, get out!" I yelled through the smoke. "The gas lines are going to blow!"
But Clara was frozen, staring at the monster she had created. The fire was roaring now, a living beast devouring the history of the veins. I grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the dining room. The ceiling was beginning to crack. We reached the vault just as a beam collapsed behind us, blocking the front door. I shoved her into the steel room and hit the manual override. The vault door hissed shut, sealing us in the cold, silent dark as the world above us turned into an inferno. "Where are we?" Clara sobbed, her hands clawing at the steel. "We're in the only place that's safe," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. I pulled the lever Silas had shown me. The floor began to descend. As we sank into the earth, I heard the muffled boom of the gas main exploding. The house, the ruin, the fortress was gone, but the veins of the city were still open, and I was the only one who knew the way out.
The world ended in a roar of orange and black. Above us, the history of the veins, the cedar beams, the floral wallpaper, the secrets of 3 generations was being reduced to ash and floating embers. Inside the descending vault, the silence was a vacuum, broken only by the hysterical, ragged breathing of my sister. Clara was curled in the corner, her hands smelling of gasoline, her golden life finally burned down to the soot on her face. The house was gone, but the foundation held. Grandma Evelyn always said that the surface is for show, but the roots are for survival. As the hydraulic lift hit the bottom of the shaft with a heavy thud, I realized I was no longer Ilara Vane, the disinherited daughter. I was a ghost, walking through the veins of a city that thought I was dead. The air at the bottom of the shaft was stale, metallic, and bitingly cold. I pushed the manual release on the vault door. It groaned, fighting against the debris that had fallen during the explosion, before finally sliding open. The tunnel stretched out before us, illuminated by a flickering emergency lighting system that Grandma must have rigged to a separate power grid. Is he dead?" Clara's voice was a thin, broken reed. She was looking up the shaft, where a dull orange glow pulsed like the heartbeat of a dying star. "Julian?" I didn't look back at her. I was checking the monitors on the small desk in the tunnel's command alcove. If he didn't make it out before the gas main blew, then yes, he's part of the Foundation now, which is exactly what you wanted, isn't it? To bury the truth? "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "I just wanted to burn the papers. I wanted my life back." "Your life was a lie, Clara. You were standing on a trapdoor your whole life, and you finally pulled the lever." I turned to the monitors. Grandma's ghost system was still active. I hit the playback button for the exterior cameras. The screen flickered to life. There was Clara, holding the jerry can. There was Julian with the wrench. The footage was crystal clear. It showed the intent, it showed the spark, and it showed the moment Julian pushed Clara toward the flame, using her as a shield when the first backdraft hit. "He didn't care about you, Clara," I pointed at the screen. "He was going to let you burn with me. You were just another asset to be liquidated." Clara stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open. The betrayal by her partner seemed to hurt more than the loss of her fortune. She collapsed onto the cot, her eyes glazed. I didn't have time for her breakdown. I checked the tunnel map. The fire above would eventually compromise the structural integrity of the street. We had to move. "Get up," I commanded. "We're going to Pier 42. It's the only exit that hasn't been flagged by the Port Authority." As we began the long walk through the dark, the radio on the desk crackled to life. It was a police frequency. "All units, we have a total loss at 4th Avenue. Fire crews reporting multiple secondary explosions. No signs of life in the primary structure. Notify the coroner." "They think we're dead," I whispered. A dark, dangerous thought took root in my mind.
If Elara Vane was dead, the board of directors would go into a tailspin. Madeline would try to run the company from her cell. The predators would come out to play. But if I stayed dead for 48 hours, I could see exactly who was still loyal and who was waiting to feast on the remains. "We have to stay in the shadows," I told Clara, who was trailing behind me like a wounded animal. "If anyone sees you, they'll arrest you for arson. If anyone sees me, the play is over. For now, we are ghosts." We reached a junction in the tunnel where the brick gave way to modern concrete. This was the new artery Grandma had built when she was fighting the Port Authority. I found a hidden locker behind a loose stone. Inside was a change of clothes, black tactical gear, and a set of burner phones. I handed one to Clara. "Don't call anyone, not your friends, not your lawyer. If that phone pings a tower, Julian's associates will find us before the police do." "Julian's associates?" Clara stammered. "Who else is there?" "The people Madeline was smuggling for," I said, my heart cold. "The fire wasn't just about revenge, Clara. It was about destroying the evidence of the ghost fleet before the feds could trace the money back to the source." We reached the exit beneath Pier 42. I peeked through the slats of the camouflage door. The waterfront was swarming with fire trucks and news vans. The silhouette of the Rose Tower stood in the distance, dark and silent. I pulled up a news feed on the burner phone. The headline made my blood boil. "Vane heir perishes in tragic accident. Madeline Vane requests compassionate release for funeral." "She's already moving," I hissed. "She's using my death to get out of jail." I looked at Clara. She was trembling, her face white with fear. I had a choice. I could leave her here, let her face the consequences of the fire, and disappear into the night with the $40 million. Or I could use her. "Clara," I grabbed her by the shoulders. "You want to redeem yourself? You want to prove you're not just a puppet?" She nodded frantically. "Anything, just don't let them kill me." "Then you're going to make a phone call," I said. "You're going to call the prosecutor, Marcus Thorne. You're going to tell him you survived, and you're going to tell him everything Julian told you, but you're not going to mention me, not yet." I watched her dial the number. As she began to speak, I looked out at the dark water of the Sound. The house on 4th Avenue was gone, but the Vane legacy was about to be reborn in the coldest way possible. Madeline thought she was coming home to a funeral. She was coming home to an execution.
The city believed I was ash, scattered across the industrial ruins of 4th Avenue. It was a liberating sensation to be a ghost in your own kingdom. While the news channels ran montages of my life, calling me the tragic architect, I was watching the world through a grain of digital salt. Madeline had played her cards perfectly. A judge had granted her a 48-hour compassionate release for my funeral. But as I watched the surveillance feeds from the tunnels, I realized I wasn't the only one who had crawled out of the wreckage. Julian Vane was alive, scarred by the fire and driven by a primal, desperate hunger. He didn't want the Vane name anymore. He wanted the Shadow Fleet, and he was willing to kill his own sister-in-law to get the keys. I stood in the service basement of the Rose Tower, my tower. I was dressed in the gray coveralls of the night shift cleaning crew, my face hidden behind a surgical mask and a low-slung cap. To the security team, I was just another nameless soul scrubbing the floors of the wealthy. To the world, I was dead. But in my pocket, the hardware wallet from the vault felt like a ticking bomb. Clara had done her part. She was in a safe house under Marcus Thorne's protection, spilling every secret she had about Julian's restoration plan. But she didn't know the full scope. Thorne didn't know the full scope. Only I knew that at midnight, Madeline was planning to meet the Shadow Fleet's buyers in the penthouse of this very building. I took the service elevator, the one that skipped the flashy lobby and bypassed the biometric scanners I had originally designed. I had built a maintenance override into the system weeks ago, a ghost protocol that erased my presence from the digital logs as I ascended. On the 35th floor, the elevator lurched. I pulled my tablet from the cleaning cart. The screen showed the 40th floor hallway. A man was moving through the shadows. His gait was uneven, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage. Julian. He wasn't there for the meeting, he was there for the leverage. He was carrying a silenced pistol and a canister of nerve gas he'd likely stolen from the company's chemical transport division. "He's going to kill her before the meeting even starts," I whispered. My mother, Madeline, was sitting in the executive office, a glass of vintage scotch in her hand, celebrating her temporary freedom. To her, I was just a casualty of a successful business maneuver. I stepped out onto the 38th floor and headed for the ventilation shaft. I needed to reach the server room directly beneath the penthouse. If I could bridge the hardware wallet to the mainframe, I could seize control of the Ghost Fleet ships in the middle of the ocean, deadheading them until the Coast Guard could intercept. As I crawled through the ductwork, I heard the muffled sound of a struggle above me, a heavy thud, followed by the sound of glass shattering. I reached the vent grate overlooking the executive suite. Julian had Madeline pinned against the floor-to-ceiling window. His face was a map of burns and rage. "Where are the codes, Madeline? The Aegis accounts are frozen. Ilara did something to the ledger before she burned. Give me the bypass, or I'll throw you off the tower you love so much." Madeline laughed, a cold, jagged sound that chilled me more than the duct's air. "You think you're the first person to threaten me, Julian. Arthur tried. Evelyn tried. You're a thug with a wrench. You don't have the stomach to run a shadow empire." Julian pressed the barrel of the gun against her throat. "Try me. I have nothing left. The house is gone. The name is gone. I just want the money." This was the moment. I could wait. I could let them destroy each other. If Julian pulled the trigger, my mother was gone. If the police arrived, they'd both go down. But if I didn't act now, the buyers, the real monsters, would arrive, and the Shadow Fleet would disappear into international waters forever. I dropped from the vent into the server room. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Hardware wallet connected. Ghost protocol active. Suddenly, every screen in the Rose Tower flared to life, not with corporate logos, but with the footage from the 4th Avenue vault, the broker tapes, the medical logs, and a live feed of Julian holding a gun to Madeline's head. "What the hell is this?" Julian roared, looking at the massive monitors on the office wall. "It's the truth, Julian." My voice boomed through the building's PA system, distorted and deep. "It's the silver lining you were too blind to see." I triggered the floor-wide lockdown. The heavy blast shutters on the penthouse windows slammed shut, sealing them in. The elevators froze. The Rose Tower was now a high-tech cage. I walked out of the service room and up the private stairs. I entered the penthouse, still in my gray coveralls. I pulled off the mask. Madeline's eyes went wide. She looked like she had seen a demon. "Ilara, you died. The report said..." "The report said what you wanted to believe, Mother," I said, walking toward the desk. I ignored Julian's gun. I knew he was too stunned to fire. "You thought you could bury me in a ruin, but the ruin taught me how to survive. You taught me how to win." "Ilara, give me the codes," Julian shouted, turning the gun on me. "I'll kill her. I'll kill you both." "The codes don't exist anymore, Julian," I said, holding up the hardware wallet. "I just wiped the Aegis accounts. The $42 million, it's gone. I donated it to a trust for the victims of the Vane shipping environmental scandals. The Shadow Fleet is currently being boarded by the Navy in the Bering Strait. You're holding a gun in a room full of ghosts." The sound of helicopters erupted outside. Searchlights cut through the gaps in the blast shutters. Marcus Thorne had arrived with a federal task force. Madeline looked at me, her face finally reflecting the total, crushing defeat she deserved. "You ruined us. You destroyed the Vane name for nothing." "No," I said, looking her in the eye. "I saved it. I'm the only Vane left who isn't a ghost." Julian lunged at me, but I was faster. I hit the fire suppression override. A massive blast of pressurized CO2 filled the room, blinding him. I stepped behind the reinforced desk as the doors burst open. The FBI swarmed the room. Julian was tackled to the ground, his gun skidding across the floor. Madeline was led away, her compassionate release turned into a permanent stay in a maximum security ward. I stood in the center of the room, the CEO of nothing, the heir of ash. But as Thorne approached me, I didn't feel empty. I felt like the steel in the wall. "It's over, Ilara," Thorne said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "No," I said, looking at the city below. "The cleanup is over. Now we build."
They say that fire is a cleanser, but it leaves the taste of ash in your mouth for a long time. 6 months after the night the Rose Tower became a cage, the city of Seattle has a new skyline, but I have a new soul. My parents are gone, not to the grave, but to the silence of federal cells, where the Vane name holds no weight. Clara is working her way through a community service sentence, learning for the first time what it means to sweat for $1. I am the CEO of a company that no longer deals in shadows, but in transparency. Yet the final lesson Grandma Evelyn had for me wasn't in a boardroom or a vault. It was in the very soil where the ruin on 4th Avenue once stood. To build the future, you have to stop haunting your own past. The morning air on 4th Avenue was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the promise of spring. I stood on the sidewalk, looking at the construction site. It wasn't a modern warehouse or a glass high-rise. It was a replica. Using the digitized blueprints I had saved in the Ghost Protocol, I had commissioned the exact restoration of the Victorian house, down to the last cedar shingle. But this time, the foundation was reinforced with the same steel that had saved my life. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from the state penitentiary. Arthur Vane was requesting a private audience. He had sent a letter, handwritten on cheap prison paper, begging for a final act of mercy. He claimed he had information about a secret trust fund in Switzerland that even Madeline didn't know about, a bribe for his silence. I looked at the letter, then at the house. I could have that money. I could use it to expand the empire, to crush the last of the competitors who had doubted me. I could become the very thing I had spent a year fighting. The truth is in the skin, Ilara. I remembered the feel of the yellow wallpaper. I didn't call the prison. I walked to a small fire pit the workers had set up for debris. I dropped the letter into the flames and watched it curl into black flakes. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his secrets. I wanted the silence he had never given me. Silas, the architect, approached me with a small, mud-caked box. We were digging the trench for the new garden near the old oak tree. We hit something. It wasn't part of the tunnels. I opened the box. Inside was a collection of old, tarnished silver spoons, a pair of baby shoes, and a photograph of a young Evelyn Vane standing in front of this very house, holding an infant Arthur. On the back of the photo, a note was written in a vibrant, younger version of her handwriting. "For the one who loves the bones more than the gold, this is the only treasure that doesn't rot." I realized then that the vault, the $40 million, the Shadow Fleet, they were all just tests. They were the gold meant to distract the wolves. The real inheritance was the house itself, the sense of place, the knowledge that a woman could build a world and keep her soul if she knew what was worth protecting. At noon, Marcus Thorne met me at Pier 42. The Ghost Fleet was gone, sold for scrap or repurposed for environmental research.
The pier was being transformed into a public park. "You're the most powerful woman in the sector, Ilara," Thorne said, looking out at the water, "and yet you spend your weekends in a construction zone in the industrial district. Why?" "Because the Rose Tower is where I work," I said, adjusting the silver locket around my neck. "But the house is where I breathe. You can't run an empire if you don't have a place where the air is clean." Thorne smiled and handed me a final folder. "The audit is officially closed. Arthur and Madeline's appeals were denied this morning. They'll be 70 by the time they see a sunset without bars. You're free, Ilara, truly free." I drove back to 4th Avenue. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the street. The Victorian house was almost finished. It stood tall, proud, and defiant, a middle finger to the modern warehouses on either side. I walked inside. The smell of fresh cedar was overwhelming. I went to the dining room. There was no vault door anymore. In its place was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with Grandma's old journals and legal texts. I had turned the safe into a library. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, to the room that would be my bedroom. I opened the window and looked out at the city. The lights were beginning to twinkle. I could see the Rose Tower in the distance, its golden lattice glowing like a beacon. I felt a presence beside me, not a ghost, but a memory. I could almost hear the rustle of Grandma Evelyn's silk dress and the click of her cane on the hardwood. "Well done, my darling," the wind seemed to whisper. "You found the silver mining." I took the silver locket off my neck. I didn't need the key anymore. The vault was open. The secrets were told. I placed the locket on the windowsill and left it there. I walked down to the kitchen and made a pot of tea, the same cheap herbal tea Grandma used to drink. I sat at the new wooden table and listened to the house. It didn't groan or creak with rot. It hummed with the strength of a new foundation. I picked up a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. I didn't draw a bridge or a tower. I drew a garden. My name is Ilara Rose Vane. I am an architect, a CEO, and a survivor. But most importantly, I am home. And this time, the walls aren't hiding anything but the life I'm finally living.